So there's an old story about a man who had a dream one night in which he took a shovel and took his donkey and took a trip to the neighboring town. And he made his way through the town as if he knew where he was going, until he arrived at a particular home, which was a modest house of some stranger. And he went into the backyard, and he put his shovel in the dirt, and he started digging. And soon he uncovered a bag that contained jewels. He opened it up, and there were sparkling, glittering jewels, just a pile of them, just this priceless treasure. The man woke up from this dream, and he praised God for such a good omen, and he immediately picked up his shovel and hopped on his donkey and headed over to the next town. Now, the thing was, the neighboring town was Jewish, and this man and his fellow townsfolks were Christian. And sometimes there could be tension and mistrust between these two communities. So when the man arrived at the gate of the neighboring town, there was a guard who demanded to know why he was there. And the man was just so sure that God had blessed him with this dream that he did not even think about telling anything but the honest answer. And so he simply told the guard the truth about the dream he had. He didn't leave out any details. And the guard was astonished. "The house you're describing is my house," the Jewish man told the Christian man. "And last night, I had the same dream. Except I journeyed to your town, and I found a treasure buried in the yard of the house of some stranger that I came upon there." And when he described the house that he had visited in the dream, it was the Christian's man turned to be astonished, because that sounded like his home. So they both looked at each other, and they burst out laughing, and they praised God for such a blessing, and they each ran back home to their own homes. And they dug in their own yards, and what did they find? Bags full of jewels. So I came across this story when I was a young man traveling through India, trying to get as far away as I could, thank you very much, from the religion of my upbringing. And I was being led by dreams of finding spiritual treasure in foreign lands, as well as being motivated by rejecting what I had inherited. So I had concluded that Christianity was morally bankrupt, and it was spiritually dead, and it was intellectually superficial. And I was 20, by the way, and obviously pretty confident in my own moral and spiritual and intellectual determinations. Thank you very much. All of course, later to be quite humbled. But more than that, I was genuinely yearning. I was yearning for something that I couldn't quite name, and that I deeply needed, and that I hadn't found in my Lutheran upbringing. I was also genuinely hurting because of the judgmentalism and self-righteousness and aggression of so many of my fellow American Christians. And just feeling just the guilt and inadequacy that clung to me because of all of that. And I was genuinely seeking. I was genuinely following inner guidance to search for spiritual sustenance embedded in ancient wisdom from civilizations that were outside of that of my ancestors. I was seeking spiritual treasures in someone else's backyard. And what I discovered, and I'm still discovering and rediscovering to this day, is that the person who told me this story knew what they were talking about and knew who they were talking to. So in studying and practicing Buddhism in India in particular, I was gifted with beautiful and sacred and astonishing and strange experiences. And I got to learn from certifiably enlightened teachers who are at the same time very human. And I was challenged by wisdom that I probably could have avoided if I had stayed home. And the teachings and the practices of Buddhism are gifts that I continue to turn to and return to and continue to learn from. But what kept happening in my youthful trek through this far-off land was that Jesus kept showing up. Much to my chagrin at the time, because that was so uncool. But I kept on thinking about the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus' parables would just pop into my mind like Zen koans that held keys to startling insights that I hadn't considered before. And I would just have stories, unbidden, come into my heart of Jesus' mercy and compassion and healing and moral courage in the face of suffering. And I would feel a tenderness in my heart. Through what I was starting to learn and to practice in the way of the Buddha, this helped me to see Jesus fresh, on his own terms, free from the ways that so many people have used his name to justify their own bad behavior, free from the chauvinistic things that some people demand that I believe about Jesus or the church, or suffer eternal hellfire at the hands of an angry God. And I started to feel tenderly towards this Jesus, the Jesus that I met on the Sermon on the Mount, and the Jesus who would have embraced the Buddha as his brother, just like Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama embraced. I started to appreciate the ways that they were different, and the ways that they were working from very different cultures. And I began to get curious in a new way about what this God is that Jesus was intimate with and teaching about. And I began to get curious about this kingdom of God that Jesus taught about in his riddling ways. That was more of a mustard seed than a monarch. At the same time, the experience of visiting India and studying the history and philosophy and diversity of Buddhist thought throughout Asia, I was deeply humbled by just how rich and complex and foreign those traditions are. And I soon had a deep respect for how encountering someone else's religion was not just a matter of picking a few souvenirs to bring back home. And it started to occur to me that maybe the tradition in which I was raised also had a similar amount of richness and complexity and diversity that maybe I had yet to explore. I also realized that the grass is not greener on the other side. Religious corruption is a global phenomenon, I'm sorry to report. I encountered other Western seekers who shared with me stories of abuse at the hands of gurus and rinpoches. I learned about the rich history in India, not only of probably the most brilliant and incredible kind of interreligious dialogue and encounter of just ancient, rich ways that people of other religions talk with each other and work together, as well as some of the richest histories of religious violence in the world that was ongoing to this day. I learned that Tibetan Buddhism hasn't always been the most peaceful and compassionate institution in the world. I learned about, well, I could go on and on. But then also, my becoming a little bit less ignorant of the Asian continent helped me to learn that it doesn't work to reject religion altogether either, which was also an option that I was very seriously exploring at this time. But the new atheists, for all of their intelligence, they haven't learned the lessons of Stalinism and Maoism, that purifying your people of the ignorant superstitions of religion doesn't in fact bring about a world free of evil, apparently. Apparently religion is not the root of all things that are wrong with humanity, because you can reject it and still perpetrate it. So religion has been put into service of racism and nationalism and militarism and sexism and chauvinism of all kinds, you name it. But so is science, so is every single political ideology that people have cooked up. So one of the many teachings that are strikingly similar between Jesus and the Buddha, and there are many, it's really amazing, the parallels between what they had to teach. But one of these teachings that they share is that the harshest judgments of others that we can dish out should be a wake-up call to take an honest look at ourselves. They both teach that we can't get free from the central crisis of the human condition, whether you understand it as suffering, like the Buddhists do, or whether you understand it as sin, like the Christians do. You can't get free of it by running away from it, or denying it, or pretending it isn't there. And they both teach that the way to liberation can't be found out there, but very, very close to home. Perhaps even closer to us than we are to ourselves, in the beautiful words of Augustine. So I realized that there was nowhere to go that was pure and free of the issues that had troubled me, and it wouldn't help for me to run away from home. And in fact, I needed to return to home. And if I was to dig for buried treasure, I had to dig through my home dirt. Dig through my own dirt, the dirt that I inherit from my ancestors. And for me, that's meant going back into Christianity with all of its baggage for me and clearing away to the treasures of the teachings of Jesus and letting the Spirit of Jesus shine and discovering the tremendous gifts of grace. So now I'm sharing all of this with you because I know that I'm far, far alone, far from being alone in being an American of Christian upbringing who has long been fed up with the hypocrisy and bigotry and abuse and power-mongering and on that folks have too often perpetrated in the name of the Lord. I'm pretty sure that's why many of you have sought refuge in our dear church here, United Church of Christ of Valley Forge, United Church of Christ. It's also why many people have left and are continuing to leave the church. And that's why I left. And it took a higher power to compel me to return. And I'm deeply grateful it did. Not because I particularly care about the institution of the church, but because I deeply care about Jesus. And I care about what I know the reality is of God's unconditional love that Jesus can lead us to, that can heal our hearts in this broken and beautiful world. And it's because I returned to Jesus that I have been able to receive the healing power of grace that I deeply needed and that I continue to need. And it's because I returned to Jesus that I have been able to be challenged to grow in love and in humility and living with living communities of beloved people trying our best to be together in a good way through the struggles and glories of life. So I think it's really important that we kind of are addressing openly just the wounds and the crisis that have been caused because of toxic religion, you could call it. And to identify the ways that we all have found that the antidote, where the antidote is. So often the antidote to a poison grows very close to the poison itself, like jewelweed and poison ivy. And in fact, the standards by which we condemn the hypocrisy and abuse and the hatefulness of corrupted religion are in fact the standards that Jesus himself taught and modeled in the great example of the Hebrew prophets. So I don't think Jesus doesn't need to be for everybody. And it doesn't need to be for everybody who has been burned by religion. Maybe that's heresy for me to say. But I do believe that it's urgently important that those of us who are drawn to the love of Christ, and perhaps have been drawn back to the love of Christ, and perhaps have been drawn to the love of Christ despite what it is that we have felt and suffered at the hands of those who do some things in God's name. It's really important that we go as deeply as we can, and that we share the gifts that we receive as generously as we can. Because the world, our communities, our families need more people who've been formed by the compassion that Christ challenges to, the courage, the love, the humility, the faithfulness, the reverence, the gratitude that are in the way of Jesus. So one of the wonderful things about this story, about the two people who dream of finding treasure in each other's backyards, is that they wouldn't have discovered where their treasures were hidden had they not met each other and shared the dreams that they had with each other. And we live in a tremendously diverse and interconnected and cosmopolitan world, thank God. And I think we need to be able to talk with our neighbors of different religions and learn from each other as a matter of faithfulness. We need to be able to be curious about each other and to appreciate one another, as well as to be able to challenge each other and to encourage each other. And for those of us whose home is within Christianity, we need some help. We could use some help from some outside perspective. And we need to help each other out as well, to learn from the wisdom of each other so that we can go deep into this way of Jesus, this life-giving, soul-saving gift that we have to discover and to rediscover and to be formed and reformed as we share the good news that came through Jesus. And so I'm grateful that we're in this together, and I give gratitude to God. Thanks be to God.